second speaker is Stefano Tijerina, a lecturer in management at the Maine Business School, University of Maine. He has a long intro. Dr. Stefano Tijerina teaches in the areas of international business, comparative business, and ethics. Prior to his academic career, he worked in the areas of international banking and nonprofit management. He received his BA in comparative politics from Clark University, a graduate certificate in international relations from the Universidad de los Andes, and his MPA and PhD in history from the University of Maine. His current research centers on the business dynamics of the Western Hemisphere from a historical perspective. He's the author of Circumventing Empires, Canadian Business Expansion in Colombia, 1767 to 1968, forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press. And he's published articles in the Journal of Canadian Studies, American Review of Canadian Studies, Hiperstoria, Ensayos sobre Política Económica, Desafíos and Perspectivas Colombo-Canadienses, as well as chapters in several edited volumes, including Mercados en Común, Estudios sobre Conexiones Transnacionales, Negocios y Diplomacia en las Américas, and Working for Oil, Comparative Social Histories of Labor in Petroleum. He is a contributor to the New Economic Paper's history blog, activehistory.ca, and his personal blog, The Global, featured in the Bangor Daily News. In 2017, he was awarded the first Christopher Koblack Research Fellowship from the Canadian Business History Association. His paper is entitled Deja-vu from 1854, Media Propaganda and the Debates over Nationalism and Protectionism. He says, the idea of sacrificing sovereignty over free trade caused tremendous debate on both sides of the North American border. This paper will focus on the borderland media reaction over the 1854 reciprocity agreement and connect it with the current propaganda over the NAFTA revision. The paper argues that the debates between internationalists and protectionists has not changed much since then, and that there are current connections between the events that took place in 1854 and the ones that recently unfolded. Stefano, you have 20 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I'll make sure to apply to that job. Absolutely. I love Canada, as you know. My focus in my studies, as mentioned in the introduction, have to do with Canada's business expansion into Latin America and the Caribbean. And in general, understanding the history of Canadian capitalism. That's really my macro interest. And of course, one of these objectives is to understand the free trade between the United States and Canada, which eventually leads to what has been the spread of free trade agreements across the Americas, into Peru, into Colombia, et cetera, into the Caribbean. And so maybe as an intellectual exercise, it has always been important for me to go back to 1854, and because it is sort of the beginning of what Joe clearly called the first global economy, the first steps toward globalization. And of course, what happened recently with the revision of the NAFTA agreement was sort of a moment in history where maybe the graph that was being shown on the screen could have taken a very different destination if, in fact, the Trump administration had been able to end the free trade agreement that he much pressured for. And so, of course, as a historian of business, I'm interested in going back to the beginning to understand the present time and build linkages between the two moments in time and see if history actually repeats itself or if we're actually in the moments of building a new history. So James, Bruce, Earl of Elgin, and William Marcy negotiated this trade agreement in 1854 called the Reciprocity Agreement between Britain and the United States. Important to recognize that Canada was sidelined from the negotiations because it was it was a colony. It was in no position to negotiate its own trade agreement. It was sort of an instrument for both stakeholders, the United States and Britain, to develop a cohesion in this moment of global economic expansionism, which was beginning to take place right after the more protectionist policies that had been implemented in the previous decades by the British Empire. And so one important thing to highlight here is that as the negotiations were unfolding, I have become very interested in a gentleman called Israel D. Andrews, coincidentally from Maine, the state where I live, a very important person for the state of Maine that is not recognized by the history books, but that as I began to dig a little bit deeper in order to understand the dynamics of the reciprocity agreement, I found out that this gentleman, Israel Andrews, was negotiating the trade agreement behind closed doors on both sides of the border, talking to both politicians and both small businesses and other stakeholders on the on the British North American side of the border and on the United States side of the border in order to mitigate what had already been negotiated, which was a reciprocity agreement. The argument here is that the negotiations had already been cooked, if you want to call it that way, and that people like Israel Andrews were instrumental in sort of putting down fires, mitigating some sort of negative propaganda in order to convince and lobby on behalf of the reciprocity agreement and the stakeholders the challenges or the concerns that could rise from this new experiment, which was the breaking of tariffs and the beginning of what would then become the idea of breaking the sovereignty or softening the borders, if you want to call it that way, between economies. And of course, this is very experimental. This had not been engineered before. And therefore, it is important to begin to look at free trade from this moment. I teach a course called Canadian-U.S. Business Relations at the Maine Business School. A very interesting course simply because it puts a lot of emphasis on the bilateral relationships between Canada and the United States. And I begin to talk about this particular moment in time when I begin when I start the semester. Because I tell my students, if you want to understand free trade, if you want to understand United States and Canadian bilateral relations in the business world, in the economic world, you have to go back to this moment of time when, for the first time, indirectly, the Canadians are able to basically, through the reciprocity agreement, unintended by the plans of the British Empire, creates a sort of legitimacy in the market that was not really a market but a colony. And by the end of the reciprocity deal in 1866, when it closes down, actually Canada is able to develop some sort of identity by creating a market that for the Americans became legitimate, and for the Canadians it became legitimate, and for the British it became a problem because it created some sort of sovereignty where there was supposed to be no sovereignty in this colonial world of British North America. So it's important to begin to look at that because it is a moment where Canada begins to think how important trade is. And yesterday when we were having our dinner, it was clearly expressed that it is no mystery, it is no secret that Canada is dependent on the global market system more than it is on its internal market. And so I tell my students, Think about this. In this case, American students, do not realize the importance of free trade, and you continue to think very locally, while the Canadian students sitting right there where you are understand clearly that globalization, free trade, interdependency are strategic, part of strategic nation building structures in order to advance the economy. And obviously they become very surprised. And then, of course, when they hear about the 1854 reciprocity agreement, they become even more surprised. I tell them that, for example, right before the 1854 signing of the agreement, there were nationalist tendencies and protectionist tendencies in the United States, more so than on the Canadian side, simply because, well, the size of the American economy was bigger, more robust, and therefore there was more to be lost by local businesses, small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read the newspapers, you begin to get this idea that what was happening in the United States during this maybe year and a half of a propaganda campaign against NAFTA and free trade and globalization, you begin to sort of see the same thing repeating itself 150-something years ago, when the United States is again using this, not the United States, but sectors of the market were using these ideas of protectionism and nationalism, and local governments were advocating for protectionism and nationalism and pro-tariffs and pro-stiff borders. And on the other side of the border, you know, with a British empire voice, you were hearing the opposite. Free trade is a good opportunity. Free trade will be important for the region. Free trade will create new and bigger markets. So the debates that happened this past year and a half and that culminated recently have already taken place a long, long time ago. And sometimes we forget that these are ebb and flows. The important thing that I do want to point out is that so the trade agreement lasts from 1854 to 1866. During that period of time, and as the adjustments take place and the markets begin to do their own thing and businesses begin to capitalize on these initiatives and banks begin to capitalize on the initiative and the market does growth and infrastructure is developed, railway infrastructure is developed, transportation systems are developed to enhance the exchange and the trade between the two zones. By the time it ends, 1866, as a result in part to the American Revolution, to the Civil War, what you have is a short experimental moment in time that we can now go back and reflect on the macro history of free trade agreements and see that, you know, the short experiment maybe was short because it was the first experiment on free trade. And the question that I imagine, and this is my speculation, was that for those who benefited from free trade, those who benefited from the initial tastes of globalization, then were interested in making sure that Canada and the United States could again reconstruct that in the future. Therefore, after the 1866 period to the 1911 period, where there is some insular movements and internal markets and some sort of rise of nationalism and aspirations inside Canada, that maybe it was not necessary to share a market with the Americans because it was enough to share that market and that link with the privilege of being a part of the British Empire, are then rethought and reevaluated again in 1911, and those who were pro-free trade, pro-globalization, begin to dream that maybe this is the opportunity to once again return to what was possible in 1854. And as we know, and what will be discussed a little later on today, shows that on 1911 reciprocity fails, and then from 1911 all the way to the Auto-PAC period, and then the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and then the NAFTA agreement, it is finally consolidated as a real possibility that free trade could remain for a long-term period. And I think that that was the question later in this period of time, in the second half of the 20th century, how to make it last, how to make it perpetual, if you want to call it that way, and avoid that the next time around, like in the 1850s or the early 1900s, nationalist voices and protectionist voices interrupt the long-term flow of the machine of free trade and globalization. And what the outcomes of this negotiation showed was that, in fact, as in 1854, when the British and the Americans knew what had been negotiated before they even sat to tell the public that they were going to sign a reciprocity agreement, in this current era that just happened, the Americans and the Canadians, Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump, understood, as in 1854, that what they were trying to renegotiate could not be destroyed, could not be dismantled, could not be torn apart, and that maybe it was an opportunity for political propaganda to go back to their own countries, both Canada and the United States, to justify that they had done something in the name of nationalism or in the name of protectionism, when in reality, both stakeholders, both actors, both decision makers knew very well that finally free trade and the constructs of free trade were too difficult to tear apart. Finally, what happened in this last negotiation revealed that what has been constructed, this very interdependent relationship between the United States and Canada that began to be built in 1854, and that continues to be built every day as we have exchange of goods and services and people going back and forth in the border, can no longer be dismantled. And that as in 1854, as in today, under the table, behind closed doors, it was the outcomes were already set, and it was inevitable just to use as propaganda instruments to convince those who were against it, or who convinced those that were not clear of what the deal represented, to be quiet down or to be sombred by propaganda systems. One thing that I want to link as my conclusions from what happened in 1854 and what happened recently is that protectionism and nationalism, as has been constructed by this bilateral relation, can no longer have any impact in the dynamics of business. Business is operating at a very different parallel zone than the political world, and it shows that the fibers, the constructs of globalization and free trade are beyond the sovereignty of the nation state. Another thing that I argue is that as in the past, Britain used Canada as a bridge into the United States, at the present time, we begin to see that this trade agreement that was just recently renegotiated continues to serve in the minds of Europeans and of the post-Brexit Britons, that Canada is an important instrument to enter the American market. That was one of the things that was clearly shown by the conversations that have taken place with the Canada-European Union Free Trade Agreement, and the conversations that are unfolding between the Canadians and Britain as we unfold the current realities. 1854, as today, sent a clear message once again that trade agreements benefit bigger operations, bigger businesses, and that there is a theoretical trickle-down impact on small businesses, but as in 1840 and as today, small businesses are the ones that feel the biggest impact of these mega trade agreements. And that was discovered back in 1854, and that's why a gentleman like Andrews was clearly hired by both governments to mitigate the concerns of small businesses. Of course, we fast forward to today, and the small business sector is not as robust as it was in the past, but still the impact on small business is still the problem. Therefore, the nationalist and more protectionist voices advanced by the Trump administration in this current cycle of revision of the trade agreement. And that's why, on the other hand, Prime Minister Trudeau has responded to that small business sector and those constituents and advocates that understand that their small business is dependent on the U.S. market for trade and for their sustainability, the sustainability of their businesses. And one last thing, the unintended consequences of recent negotiations, as in the past, when without strategically planning it, the reciprocity agreement strengthened Canada as a player within the global economy by allowing it to trade sort of like a sovereign market, if you want to call it that way, with the United States. Today, the unintended consequence of the negotiations that took place is that for the first time, it is clear in the minds of Canadian policymakers, and it is clear in the minds of Canadian citizens and Canadian businesses that the interdependency with the United States is not good business for Canada, and that the diversification of trade is the objective down the road, and there is no way to turn that back. And for the United States, on the other hand, it's problematic that finally its most important partner realized that it's no longer as important, as the global system offers Canada many, many more options than the United States. So clearly a wrong read from the Americans, clearly a very interesting and effective and efficient read from the Canadian government. And finally, vulnerability, I would say, in the past, in 1854, clearly was on the side of Canada. I argue that today, vulnerability is more on the side of the United States, not measuring on today's size of the economy, but measuring it on the fact that the world is much bigger today than just the United States, and that Canada has many, many more options, and the United States has lesser and lesser options unless it changes its rhetoric. Thank you very much.